All right, we are recording then.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, here we go, everybody. So we're going to talk about PreAward today. We have a lot of slides to get through. I think last year this was broken into like 1.5 sessions. The second half is predominantly about the UG uniform guidance. So today, as I'm going through, certainly use the chat box if you have any questions or comments along the way. There's going to be like some test questions for you all to guess the answers. I'm going to focus on sort of breadth today, getting through a whole host of topics. The slide decks will be available to you all to go through and review and use as study tools. So there's going to be certain sections where there's a lot of definitions or descriptions or details about, say, different NIH funding mechanisms. I'm going to focus on moving through versus reading every single bullet point. So just housekeeping notes. And with that, let us begin. Let me see here. Okay. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the research lifecycle, which we touched on last week. We're going to talk about funding mechanisms in research, sponsored research, specifically talking about contracts, grants, cooperative agreements, IPAs. And we're going to spend some time, going deep into NIH and NSF. Their setup is agencies and institutes, and then also go heavy into their proposal process, as well as other agency-specific unique things for each of them, as those are both featured heavily in the body of knowledge and on the exam. And then after that, we'll take a little time for questions and then go through a little UG overview, which is in another slide deck. So let's begin. If you recall from last week, we talked about the research funding life cycle. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the pre-award phase, focusing most significantly on the proposal submission and the receipt of funding, AKA the award phase. So some funding mechanisms. There's a lot of conflation across the industry with sponsors, with different people talking about contracts, grants. There's a tendency to call every agreement a contract, and from a certain point of view, yes, it's a legal agreement, therefore it's a contractual arrangement. Yes, that's true. But in the federal sense, all these words have very specific connotations and they mean very different things. So a grant and a contract, from the federal perspective, if we're talking about awards from NIH, a grant or a contract would mean very different things are at play. So we're going to talk a little bit about those. So a grant is usually initiated by an investigator, applying to a certain solicitation or a program announcement. The purpose of a grant is assistance. So the government is seeking to assist the grantee in their proposed objectives and scope. The purpose is also for the public good. So you think about UVA's mission of furthering knowledge and research. The benefit the greater good. The government also has a vested interest in that. And so they're going to assist us in fulfilling our mission because it's strategic to them. And it's not to be restricted for commercial or internal use. Solicitation method, often these will be funding opportunity announcements, FOAs, requests for proposal or requests for application. We talked a little bit about some of those types of things last week. The applicable guidelines to a federal grant would be uniform guidance 2 CFR 200. There could be agency-specific guidelines, like think about the NIH grants policy statement, the PAPPG for NSF. DoD has some of their own terms and conditions that would be in play in addition to the uniform guidance. And the scope may remain flexible. So there's a lot of, in the grant space and the assistance space, the sponsors typically are much more flexible. Say if you need a no-cost extension or there's something else comes up during implementation, the sponsor might be more willing to modify the agreement or make changes. And we'll talk more about some of those things as we get into NIH and NSF. Similarly, there's a little bit more about a grant. The involvement by sponsor, how up in your business is the sponsor? Typically in a grant, there's limited involvement in the programmatic implementation, the technical implementation. There's probably some reporting, some other things, but usually, the grantee is the one sort of running the show. Rebudgeting, there's normally flexible terms to that. Equipment title, usually anything purchased under an award, the title is going to vest with the grantee. And the performance period is going to be specified in the award document. There could be multiple budget periods, thinking about like an NIH R01, that might be a 5-year award. There could be 5 budget periods. Those are pretty common things. Similarly, a cooperative agreement is also federal assistance, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The initiation's typically by the sponsor, and the key word here is sort of cooperative. They're going to be much more involved. So this is something that they're interested in being technically engaged in as well. The purpose, though, you'll notice is essentially the same. Once again, it's federal assistance, and the purpose is for the public good, with the caveat of there's going to be substantial sponsor involvement in the technical implementation. Solicitation methods are the same as a grant typically. Applicable guidelines and regulations, those should look familiar because they're the same as the grant. They're going to be subject to uniform guidance. There could be other agency-specific guidelines. In addition to that, the scope typically, there's going to be some flexibility there. Where it differs from a federal grant is in the involvement by a sponsor, and there's going to be substantial collaboration in the technical implementation of the project. Federal grants, you can kind of think of, the government's going to be a little hands-off. They're going to just, require their normal reports, checking on progress. But in terms of the day-to-day, week-to-week implementation of objectives, they're going to be a little bit further removed. In a cooperative agreement, the PI, principal investigator, is going to have a lot more regular meetings with their technical counterparts at the sponsor. They could be joint planning meetings. There's just going to be a lot more engagement along the way on the technical side. But in terms of rebudgeting, normally there's the flexible terms. Equipment title, it could vary because of the sponsor's engagement, but typically it could vest just in the grantee as well. And the performance period is going to be the same, should be called out in the award document. Could include multiple budget periods, thinking of a funding mechanism like the U01 from NIH, which we'll talk about in a little bit later. So the key takeaway here, grants, cooperative agreements, they're both federal assistance. They're both fall under uniform guidance. The key differentiator is how involved is the sponsor in the technical implementation. In a grant, there's limited engagement. In a cooperative agreement, there's substantial engagement. And that takes us to the federal contract, which is fundamentally different in several of these categories we'll see here in a second. Now, the initiation is typically by the government, by the sponsor. The purpose, you'll note, is entirely different. The purpose is the acquisition or procurement of goods or services. So the federal government is seeking to acquire, procure, purchase something, goods and services, and you'll see the other note here under purpose, for the good of the government. So the government, in the course of its role functioning as a government, needs to procure certain things. And so they'll issue a broad agency announcement, request for quotation, request for proposal to procure something to help them do their job. So that's, you can hear even in the articulation of that, it's very different than them being interested in furthering, assisting the research mission of these other groups working on behalf of the public good. Here, the government is looking to procure something for its own objectives and goals and needs. So it's very different purpose. And along with that, it's not subject to uniform guidance, it's subject to the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which govern federal procurement. And there's, similarly to the uniform guidance, there's going to be some other agency-specific clauses, such as the DFARS, the HSARS. NASA has their own FAR supplement as well. Typically, the scope cannot be altered because the government says, we're buying this service, this is what we need, this is what you need to deliver. So there's a lot less flexibility here. And then, the recipient of the contract, if for some reason we don't carry out what we said we were going to do, we could default on the contract, and there could be a lot more risk and sort of legal tricky business along with that. The involvement by the sponsor typically is going to be more extensive because the government is very specific about what they need, very specific about the timeline for which they want it delivered. And so they're going to be closely monitoring the progress of whatever they're procuring. Rebudgeting could be very restrictive as well because there's certain FAR clauses and there's certain other conditions that could be in play in a federal contract that don't have the same sort of flexible understanding maybe of a grant or a cooperative agreement. Equipment title typically is going to be to the government, though there's some thresholds at play depending on the FAR clauses that might be in our contract. But once again, if you think about the purpose of a federal contract, this is all about the government procuring something for themselves versus the government assisting someone else with their mission. And so it would make sense that some of these things would benefit the government, such as any equipment being purchased to carry out the same for the government. They might want title to that at the end. The performance period is going to be specified in the contract. Invoices and payments could often be tied to deliverables or performance schedules. There's also the possibility it could be fixed price, could be cost reimbursable. It really depends on the funding announcement. But both of those options are there. In the last funding mechanism, a little bit less common, the Intergovernmental Personnel Agreement, known as the IPA, the most tasty of all the funding mechanisms. The purpose allows university faculty to temporarily be assigned to a federal agency while maintaining their university status, typically less than 3 years. Salary, fringe, and travel are covered. I've seen these come through a number of times for some of our engineering faculty with, say, NSF. And there's a form link here that will show you sort of the template that award instrument looks like. And the involvement by the sponsor is extensive because we're basically, one of our faculty is going to go work on behalf of the federal agency. And so they're very obviously keen and being engaged in that arrangement. So here is sort of the same information presented in a table format. Hopefully this is a helpful studying tool. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because we just talked through all this, but sort of lists the three main mechanisms: the grant, the cooperative agreement, and the contract. I think the really important ones, the type of award, assistance versus acquisition, and the regulation on the bottom row, the UG versus the FAR, those are exactly in parallel with the assistance versus acquisition. And on this next chart, you'll see on the left-hand side is the federal assistance. On the right-hand side is federal procurement or acquisition. And let's see, where's my cursor? So the federal government can award a grant. And then the grantee could say have a subrecipient, a subaward, and the prime agreement would flow all the way down this tree. Everyone would be beholden to uniform guidance and all the terms of, say, the NIH award. But under a grant, we could choose to procure something, supplies, materials, a consultant, and that would be a contractor, what used to be called a vendor relationship underneath a grant. So on the federal assistance side, you can have grants, you can have sub-grants. All of our outgoing subs sort of live in this world, but then there could be contractors and subcontractors underneath and we'll talk a little bit later in the UG about how you distinguish whether or not someone is a sub-grantee or a contractor. On the federal acquisition or procurement side, once again, here's the purpose piece: to buy, acquire, purchase, or procure. We're going to have FAR clauses at play. We're going to have, other federal procurement clauses at play. You can have a contractor, you can have a subcontractor, and sort of beyond that. So this is just another helpful tool for studying and for sort of visualizing some of the relationships of federal awards. And let me make sure that's okay. Yeah, and if you ever have any comments or questions, throw them in the chat box. But we'll keep going along here. So types of sponsors. So UVA or other research institutions will get funding from a whole host of different types of groups. So federal agencies, probably most common, the state, or in our case, the Commonwealth of Virginia, foundations. Think of like Gates Foundation or smaller medical foundations. I was looking at an award from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation the other day. There could be internal or institutional funding. There's also national organizations or corporations, American Heart Association, other universities. Mary Beth and I were actually looking at one the other day where University of Massachusetts was giving us some of their own funds. So the source of funds is actually from another university and they're not a flow through, which is interesting. Not super common, but certainly possible. And then industry sponsors, which we'll see a lot from pharmaceutical companies or sort of on the defense contracting side, Lockheed Martin or Rolls-Royce or some of these other groups. The most common sponsors for UVA, but also for a lot of research institutions, are going to be the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation. Department of Defense or Department of Education are maybe 3 and 4, but if you look at UVA's totals for every year, there's a very clear number 1 and number 2. And on the CRA exam, the body of knowledge, there's a lot about NIH and NSF in particular. And so we're going to spend some time today talking through both of these groups. So NIH, it falls under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It is one of 11 public health service agencies within DHHS. Some of the other groups, FDA, CDC. Here's NIH's mission. And I'll let you guys read this for yourselves. It's also, you can obviously go to the NIH website. Let's see, NIH typical current budget, I believe, is about $30 billion. The amount for extramural research, meaning outside parties such as UVA, is about $24 billion. Each awarding institute or center, ICs, has its own mission and priorities, budget, and funding mechanisms. And you can go and read about these. There's 27 institutes and centers, plus the Office of the Director. And so here is a whole list of all the acronyms of all the groups. I'll let you read these, come back and look at them. Here is sort of a visual overview of the NIH. So 27 institutes and centers, plus the Office of the Director. All of them have funding authority except for these 3, the NIH Clinical Center, the Center for Information Technology, and the Center for Scientific Review. Everyone else, including the Office of the Director, will issue awards and has funding authority. And so, we get funding from a whole host of these institutes and centers. When we look a little bit later at the NIH award nomenclature, you'll see where the institute and centers come into play. So, pop quiz. How many ICs, institutes and centers, fund grants for extramural research? See if anybody's awake. Put it in the chat box. We got an A, we got a C, we got another C. We got lots of C's. It's fitting that C's is putting all the C's, but yeah. Anyway, too many jokes. Okay. Side note, I realize that now that I'm a dad, that any joke I make is technically a dad joke, and that was kind of disconcerting, but we'll move along. Yes, the answer is C, 24 institutes and centers, plus the Office of the Director. I think I either saw this actual question on the CRA or on a practice exam. So these are just sort of the flavor of questions that you might see, which means, there's all these little details in studying the body of knowledge and all the materials that, like, flashcards are a great thing to try to remember some of these things. So the Institute and Center extramural team consists of several different members, the program official, the scientific review officer, the grant management officer and grant management specialist, or the contract officer and contract specialist. This would sort of depend on whether NIH is giving us an assistance award or a acquisition award, a federal contract. Types of NIH funding. So here's sort of a table presentation of the different funding categories and award mechanisms of NIH. Research grants, career development awards, research training and fellowships, project or center grants, cooperative agreements. Next, we're going to have a whole host of slides talking about the different types. I'm just going to highlight a few of them, but they're all going to be here in the slide deck for you to look at. They're also all on the NIH's site. This is all the type of stuff that is good to flashcard and work on being familiar with for the CRA exam. So most famously and most commonly, the R01, the NIH Research Project Grant Program. No specific, so it's the most commonly used grant program. That's something important to note. Used to support a discrete, specified, circumscribed research project. There's no specific dollar amount unless it's specified in the funding opportunity announcement, and typically advanced permissions required if you're going to propose more than $500,000 in direct costs in any year. They're typically 3 to 5 years in length, and all the institutes and centers utilize this mechanism. We got the small grant program, the R03. And so each of these slides is going to similarly break down, any dollar or year limits or key facts, like they're not renewable. So when you're studying, feel free to make flashcards or organize your information however is best suited for you. Conferences and scientific meetings, that would be an R13 or a U13. Here's the R15. Let's see, the R21 and R33. So this is the Exploratory Developmental Research Grant Award. The R33 is the second phase of support for research that starts under an R21. Typically, the budget for direct costs for the 2-year period can't exceed $275,000, and most of the institutes and centers utilize those. Resource-related research projects, R24, education projects, clinical trial planning grant in R34. So these are designed to permit early peer review for proposed clinical trials, typically limited to 3 years, and there's some dollar thresholds as well. The modular budget is required to be used all the time, and we'll talk a little bit about modular budgets in a minute. And only select institutes and centers will use the R34 mechanism. So last week, we talked a little bit about STTRs and SBIRs. So if you recall, certain agencies utilize these programs. And so here's NIH's implementation of the STTR. It's the R41 and R42. Just similarly, as we talked about last week, there's a 3-phase structure. So typically, this would come to us where an industry sponsor, if you recall from last week, they have to be US owned by like 51% or more with a certain employee limits. They would apply to this, and then we would sub to them, and that's sort of how this mechanism works. Similarly, the SBIR, NIH's R43 and R44. The R56 is the high priority short-term project. And it's typically funded for 1 or 2 years. And then the K awards, so the K01, these are sort of the early career new investigator awards, could provide up to 5 years of support. And then afterwards, this would transition to an R01. And so the K01 is restricted to US citizens or permanent residents. And then the K99 or R00 can be a non-US citizen. So the fellowship and training grants, you can see here just sort of the different mechanisms for predoctoral, postdoctoral, senior fellows. Stipends are determined by NIH annually. For K&T awards, there could be some F&A limits of 8%. For F grants, there's institutional allowance. And then the U01, similarly to the R01, but in this case, you'll note cooperative agreement. And so recalling from our earlier slides, that means NIH, the technical staff are going to be much more involved. Typically on U01s, carry forward is going to be restricted, which if you think about sort of the understanding of cooperative agreement, it would make sense that they would want a little bit more control since they're going to be more engaged in the project implementation. And so NIH will use these when substantial programmatic involvement is anticipated between the awarding institute and center. And it's one of many types of cooperative agreements that NIH can utilize. The project grants, so the P01, P20, P50, these are multi-project research projects involving a number of independent investigators. There's not necessarily a specific dollar amount unless it's specified. On a lot of these, really important to read the funding opportunity announcements for specific requirements related to these programs. Exploratory grants is the P20. So this is used to support planning activities associated with large multi-project program grants. The P30, the center core grants. So these are used to support shared resources and facilities for a number of different investigators, maybe from different disciplines. And then the P50 is specialized center. And yeah, this, there could be big consortiums engaged, a lot of multidisciplinary activities going on in these programs. NIH funding opportunities. So typically there could be a program announcement that one institute or center is requesting a particular scientific area. Then there will be an RFA, the official invitation. There could also be a parent announcement for unsolicited applications, which don't fall within the scope of targeted announcements. And for NIH grants guidelines, NIH has a grants policy statement here, as well as here's a link to how to apply and all the different forms and requirements that NIH has. A lot of you all are probably familiar with NIH's grants process and the policy statement. Certainly with the amount of funding we get from them, a lot of our policies and procedures are shaped and influenced by NIH. The grants policy statement is great nighttime reading, but is a lot of pertinent things. It covers the whole gamut of, what happens if an investigator is moving to another institution? How do you relinquish? How do you do extensions, prior approval requests? There's a whole host of information here. It's several hundred pages long. Recommend reading that and checking that out. So the NIH grants process starts with the Center for Scientific Review Group. It assigns the institute and center in the study section. The study section reviews for scientific merit. The institute evaluates for relevance. The advisory council and board recommends action, and the institute director makes a funding decision. And this site probably looks familiar to all of you. ERA Commons. This is NIH's online portal. Assist within Commons is the spot where we submit proposals, RPPRs, prior approval requests, closeouts, just in times, a whole host of things that go on here every day. And I'm guessing just from working with many of you that you're quite familiar with the ins and outs. So ERA Commons Assist, which I just mentioned, the proposal portal within ERA Commons for the NIH. They utilize the SF424 R&R standard form. And so these are a host of the normal requirements that we have to submit on every proposal. So there's a cover form, there's information about the performance site locations, key personnel. There could be either the SF424 R&R budget or a modular budget, and we'll read a little bit about that, or we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. If we have subawards, they would also have to fill out a budget. And then there's a bunch of PHS 398 forms as well, depending on exactly which funding mechanism we are proposing to. Modular budgets. So the program announcement or funding mechanism may allow the budgets to be submitted in a modular budget format. Modular budgets are for proposals under $250,000 direct cost per year. So some of these dollar amounts are the types of things that could come up on a CRA exam. So memorizing all these thresholds and these types of things are really prudent. Direct costs in each year must be in increments of $25,000. The modular budget form requires only bottom line total direct and indirect and does not require detailed category information. So this is NIH basically saying for certain announcements or certain funding mechanisms, we're going to try to make your life a little bit easier. we're just going to budget in chunks of 25,000. And we're not going to ask for a breakdown. Just give us the total direct and the subsequent indirect and a budget justification showing details about the personnel. And that's all we need. So that certainly makes things administratively much simpler. But if you read in the grants policy statement, it will say additional budget justifications are required if the total direct costs increase or decrease from year to year. So if we were submitting a 3-year award, say, and our direct costs were 100,000 in year 1, 150,000 in year 2, 150,000 in year 3, we'd have to justify the change between the years. And a consortium justification for all the subcontractors. So if we were going to have subs as well, then we would need corresponding justification. Another NIH wrinkle is the salary cap, and this is true for most PHS institutions as well, or agencies rather. So every year, as Congress adjusts the federal executive level 2 salary range, this applies to NIH salary cap. So this year it went up from 192,300 to 197,300. And so the percentage of effort charged on NIH salary cap cannot be based on a salary more than the cap. So basically, if we had a PI or personnel earning, 250,000, they're working 5% on the project. Well, in the budget, we have to cap their salary at 197,300 and take 5% off of that. And then, the difference, that salary above the cap, we have to track internally, and this is done via effort reporting. It's like internal cost share, but we don't have to report it to NIH because it's not actually committed in the way that we would normally think about committed cost share. And that's driven by a statutory requirement. So we'll talk more about cost share later, but just the NIH salary cap is a wrinkle that they have. Another NIH policy related to financial conflict of interest. So this is true for PHS agencies. Financial conflict of interest must be disclosed before a PHS proposal can be submitted. And this would also apply to subrecipients, consultants, and collaborators. And then prior to expenditure of any NIH funds under a new award, an institution must report to NIH the existence of any conflicting financial interest, and then what steps have been taken to manage that. Conflicts must be reported within 60 days, and the institutional FCOI officer submits a report in the ERA Commons. For us, this is something that Dave Hudson has historically done. And then all investigators on the PI's project team must complete conflict of interest training prior to conducting any research with NIH funds. So for us, our city COI training, this is why we're always asking about these things. And important to note the definition of what is an investigator. Great question, glad you asked. It means the project director or principal investigator and any other person, regardless of title or position, who is responsible for the design, conduct, or reporting of research. And so that could be co-PIs, postdocs, grad students. That's a very broad definition. So that's something important to note and pay attention to. Consultants may or may not qualify as investigators. It really depends on their role. Service providers are not considered investigators. Any questions so far? Just take a pulse check. See if everybody's doing okay. Seems like it, but the interesting environment of virtual training sessions. So the NIH award process. So here's sort of just a map showing with the timeline of the different steps: planning, writing, submitting. Then there's receipt and referral. It talks about how an application gets assigned out to an institute and center in a scientific review group here in months 1 to 3. And then it goes through the peer review process, initial level review, there's scoring, summary statement gets available. These things are available to the PI on ERA Commons. Goes to a second level review with the advisory council and board. And then it comes to the award phase, and now we're 9 or 10 months away typically The Institute or Center grants management staff is conducting the final administrative review and negotiating the award. And then finally, there's a notice of award issue. And congratulations, a year later, or however long, 9, 10, 11 months, the project period officially begins. So here's just some more about the review process. So the first level review, the scientific review group, so that is back over here. It's composed primarily of non-federal scientists who have expertise in relevant scientific disciplines and research areas. They receive access to the grant applications about 6 weeks prior to the peer review meeting. And so they're going to work on preparing a written critique of each proposal based on the review criteria and assign a numerical score to each of those criteria. And then they're going to make recommendations in the form of final written comments. They'll make recommendations concerning human subjects and animals as it relates to the application. And they're going to make recommendations concerning the appropriateness of the budget request as well. The second review criteria, significance. Does the project address an important problem? Investigators, is the research team well suited to be the ones doing this project? Innovation. Does the application challenge and seek to shift current research clinical practice paradigms by using novel concepts or methodologies, et cetera? The approach, is the strategy, methodology, budget, and analysis sufficient and well-reasoned and appropriate to accomplish the specific aims? So basically, does the proposal, it sounds great, but can it actually be carried out with the resources that are being proposed? Environment, so does the project director or PI have suitable and sufficient facilities and equipment and institutional support to carry out the research plan? And sometimes there'll be additional criteria as well relating to protection of human subjects, inclusion of women, minorities, and children, vertebrate animals, biohazards. Is this a resubmission? Is it a renewal? Is it a revised application? What other things are going on? Select agents, budget, and period support. And then, if it was an application from a foreign organization, the reviewers have some additional steps they need to take as well. And so here's an example of the scoring sort of guide that the peer review group would use. So the second level review, the Institute and Center National Advisory Council or Board, these are composed of both scientific and non-scientific members chosen for their expertise, interest, or activity in matters related to health and disease, chosen by the respective institute or center, approved by DHHS, and in some cases appointed by the president. So the program staff members examine their applications, their impact priority scores, the summary. They provide a grant funding plan to the advisory board and council. Then the advisory board and council will consider the larger goals of the institute and center and advise the IC director. And the IC director is going to make final funding decisions based on the staff and the advisory council board advice. So after the proposal, all that stuff's happening out of the purview of, say, us here at UVA. That's happening within NIH. But on our side, there are certain things that we might encounter between the proposal phase and the award phase. So NIH has a just-in-time mechanism where they will request more timely information prior to making the final award decision. So typically, documents they might be asking for is an updated other support for all the key personnel, also possibly including key personnel that we have at the sub, if we have any subs, IRB or IACUC approvals, if there's human or animal subjects involved, and correspondingly human subject education information. So in our case, have the investigators completed the city HSR training? Is their certification up to date? We would submit all those via ERA Commons. So then finally, all that happens 10, 11 months later, we get a notice of award. And so that's the legally binding agreement between NIH and your institution. And it typically includes the following, identifies the PI or PIs, if there's co-PIs, the project and award number. It establishes the funding level. It establishes the period of support. And oftentimes there will be a distinction between the budget period and the project period. So in the example of the R01, maybe there's a 5-year proposed project period, but right now they're just funding budget period number 1. So you might have 2 sets of dates on a notice of award. It's going to set forth terms and conditions, reporting requirements, and list all the contact information for NIH staff, the program officials, on the technical side that the PI would be engaging with, and then the grants management specialist sort of on the agreement or contractual side that up here at OSP or in the school, at school level would be talking to about any issues with the award or negotiating any things that might come down. And the award is accepted when funds are drawn down. So typically NIH awards would be unilateral, meaning there's no signatures required, and those would come in, the notice of awards there, and then as soon as we draw down funds, that constitutes acceptance. And so here's a little bit about NIH project numbers. NIH likes to have these nice long award numbers, and sometimes you look at them and it's like, what does this even mean? But there's actually a method to the madness. So you can see here sort of color coded. The first character is a number, it's the type of application. We're going to talk through in a second all the possibilities of the types. The next in the green, the funding mechanism. We talked about these earlier, like a T32 or an R01. The blue is the institute or center. So this, you remember way back, we went through all the institutes and centers. They all have a prefix, and it would reflect whichever institute or center is funding the award would reflect in the project number. The next is the award number there. It's 6 digits, followed by the year or budget period. So 01, 02, 03. And then if there's a supplement or amendment or something else going on, that'll get tacked on to the end. In this case, in the second example there, S1 would indicate that it's a supplement. So the types, we're going to talk a little bit about this first character here. Here are all the types of NIH applications. So type 1 is a new award. Type 2 is competing continuation. 3 is the competing supplement. Funded extension awards, so that would be type 4. Non-competing continuations are type 5. If there was a transfer from one grantee institution to another, say a PI came to UVA from somewhere else, and that award was eventually transferred, that would end up with a type 7 in the front. And there's a couple types for if the institute or center is changing from the original award to the continuation, or the original award to the renewal, that would reflect with 8 and 9. A couple other NIH things before we get on to NSF. So pre-award costs, the grantee may, at its own risk and without NIH approval, incur obligations and expenditures to cover costs up to 90 days before the beginning date of the initial budget period, assuming that those costs are necessary to conduct the project and they'd be allowable under the grant if awarded without NIH approval. Let's see, Ian has a question. If type 2 can be a supplement, then it's different than the S1. Yeah, so type 2 is a competing continuation. A supplement, if there's a supplement coming into the existing award, so year 3, say, is getting supplemental funding for some reason, that would get the postfix. Oh, type 3. Oh, competing supplement. Yeah, I think, does anyone know the question that offhand? The difference between type 3 and a supplement within a current award? If not, I'll find the answer and get back to you, Ian. It's escaping my mind presently. Pre-award costs. Yeah, so NIH, and we'll talk a little bit more about the federal research terms and conditions, which grant some flexibilities from certain federal agencies, NIH being one of them. So basically, you get an award, it starts October 1st. Without having to ask NIH for approval, we can back up that spending 90 days for any startup costs or other costs. Granted, those costs need to be eligible and allowable. So that means just because we're spending these things before the grant started doesn't mean that they're not subject to the same cost principles or regulations. Another flexibility the NIH gives out, if there's no other restrictions in the terms and conditions of the award, a first no-cost extension can be requested in ERA Commons and is automatically approved. It must be submitted before the current project end date. If we need a second no-cost extension or a third no-cost extension, that would require prior approval. So we'd have to submit that request. NIH would review it and get back to us. And typically a justification and possibly other documents are required as well. So there's a built-in flexibility here. If you recall, at the beginning, we're talking about grants, cooperative agreements. There's built-in flexibilities, and these are some examples of those. If this was a federal contract, there wouldn't be some of these mechanisms in place to try to make our life a little easier. So question, what is NIH's most common funding mechanism? Everybody's on top of it. Wow. Y'all are right, it's B, R01. Pre-award costs may be incurred up to how many days prior to the start of the award without prior approval? You guys are so good. Modular budgets must be in direct cost increments of ... You guys are on fire. This is great. This is awesome. Okay. Any other questions about NIH? We're about to go on NSF. I think we're doing good on time. Everybody okay? Great. NSF, National Science Foundation. It's an independent federal agency which was created by Congress in 1950 to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare by supporting research and education in all fields of science and engineering. Their annual budget, I think this is from last fiscal year, is about $7.5 billion. They fund research and education in science and engineering through grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements. And about 24% of federal, they provide about 24% of federal support to academic institutions for basic research. They fund about 11,000 grants per year. Categories of funding opportunities. So NIH has their own sort of nomenclature for the way they announce their funding opportunities and types of submissions. Down below here, you'll see a note, the NSF proposal and award policies and procedures, aka the PAPPG, is revised annually and is similar, I suppose, to the NIH grants policy statement. More good nighttime reading about all of NSF's requirements. This will detail all the things related to awards or proposals from NSF. And yeah, the PAPPG would govern anything submitted via Fastlane or research.gov. There could be program-specific guidelines released that would be in addition to these standard requirements. So NSF will issue program solicitations or announcements. There could be supplemental calls for like RAUs, research experience for undergrads. There could be Dear Colleague letters. And types of submissions, there could be a letter of intent phase, a preliminary proposal, and a full proposal. So here's an example of a Dear Colleague letter. These are all posted on the NSF site. And here's just a screen grab from last year of some of the funding opportunities that were out on the NSF site. And this is an example talking about, in Fastlane, you would apply to this program. It talks about, the PAPPG being in play. Here's a couple contacts at NSF if our investigator had any questions or those types of things. And here's just another example. Here's sort of the due dates and different things going on. Here's an example of solicitation. Once again, you know, it's referencing back to the PAPG. The PAPPG has all the dates. Types of proposals. So NSF has a whole host of their own mechanisms. The rapid grants for rapid response research. So with the program officer's approval, an investigator can propose proposal tackling with some severe urgency, either to availability or access of data. So I think there's been a lot of rapid proposals in response to COVID, for example, typically up to 200,000 for 1 year. Eager proposal, so these are early concept grants for exploratory research. Once again, you need a program officer's approval to submit their exploratory work in early stages on untested but potentially transformative research ideas or approaches. Fund up to 300,000 for 2 years. You have the RAISE proposal, the goalie proposal, and then there's a lot of other interesting ones as well. So the Ideas Lab, conference proposals, equipment proposals, travel proposals, center proposals, research infrastructure proposals. And this specific page here in the PIPPG goes into detail about all of these and some of the different things that are required. So I would recommend you check this out. NSF proposal elements. So these are sort of the standard things that are required. And we'll talk a little bit about FastLane and research.gov in a second. So there's a cover page that has the program announcement, number, title, period of performance, start date. The project summary needs to include an overview and then sections about intellectual merit and broader impact. The project description, it's typically going to be 15 pages, but for some of the other mechanisms like the eager and the rapid, there's going to be reduced page limits, 9 for the eager, 5 for the rapid. It's going to have broader impact and also results from prior NSF funding if applicable. There's going to be a reference cited section. There's going to be biosketch limited to 2 pages. You can have 10 products allowed and up to 5 synergistic activities. Sometimes you'll see investigators trying to get creative with, you know, they'll have their 5 synergistic activities, but then each one will have like A, B, and C, and it's like, no, that's like 15. So it's important to pay attention to all those little details, also called out in the PAPPG. Current and pending. Will they really ask questions on the exam about page limits? I'm trying to remember. There's lots of, man, it's like a blur. There's lots of nitty-gritty questions about different proposal mechanisms. I don't remember if they're asking specifically about page limits, but I'll see if I can find one of the sample tests that I took from last year and see if there's a question along those lines. Current and pending, based on person months. The budget, there's a 2-month salary limit on all senior personnel. Justification is subject to a 3-page limit. And then there can be other documentation required as well, facilities, equipment, and other resources, data management plan, collaborators and other affiliations, postdoctoral mentoring plan. And then once again, sort of the underlying rule is, you know, read your solicitation or program announcement because there could be other things required. And for NSF, no voluntary cost share is allowed typically. NSF also has a collaborative proposal mechanism where a bunch of institutions can apply together in a collaborative proposal, and then NSF will make awards individually to each institution. And there's sort of 2 ways the NSF collaborative proposal can work. Typically, the lead institution will submit sort of a whole host of documents, and you can see them outlaid here. And then the non-lead organization would also submit, there's a way to link up your proposals in FastLane and research.gov indicating they're collaborative. And so the non-lead organizations would also submit their own proposals, and then NSF would review all that together. And then if awarded, each institution would get their own individual award. The proposal review and processing for NSF, you can see it's sort of broken out here, the different phases. So the opportunities announced, proposal preparation and submission. There's 90 days from the opportunity to the due date typically. Proposer should allow up to 6 months for programmatic review and processing. So there's reviewer selected, peer review, program officer recommendation, division director review, and then award processing. The grants and agreements division usually takes about 30 days after the program division has recommended something for funding to do the final business review and then the award being finalized. NSF merit review. So all NSF projects should be of the highest quality and have the potential to advance, if not transform, the frontiers of knowledge. And so there's 2 key criteria that NSF likes to review, and that's intellectual merit and broader impacts. And those are called out in the funding announcements and in the way the project descriptions are put together. So those are important things to remember in relation to NSF for the exam. So the proposal and award timeline, we talked about this a little bit already. So this is a breakdown of how, I think it's actually from NSF site, their own little diagram about how it works. So there's 90 days for the proposal time. There's 6 months for this programmatic review. And then there's 30 days, if the division director is issuing an award for the processing of that award by the Division of Grants and Agreements. And so NSF awards, once again, these are typically unilateral. We'll get an email notification that our award has been approved and funded. A request to draw down funds usually constitutes acceptance. However, in some limited circumstances, there could be some sort of formal acceptance required. Composition of NSF award will typically include any special conditions, any amendments, the general federal award information required by the uniform guidance. One of the great things about the UG is it doesn't just apply to universities such as ours, it also applies to federal agencies and helps standardize the things that they're required to provide, both in their funding announcements and also in their awards. An NSF award is also going to include the budget and broken down by category, applicable conditions, the proposal, and then any other type of special requirements that might be noted. So that's it about NSF. Talk just a little bit about notices of award on the whole. So notice of award, or NOA, is a legally binding document. In the federal sense, we've talked about this a little bit. It could be a grant, could be a cooperative agreement, could be a federal contract. In the broader sense, including foundations and industry, et cetera, could take a lot of different forms. But the important thing to note is the notice of award is the official legally binding document committing the university to whatever terms and conditions, as well as to the scope of work for the budget for the period. Notice of award should include the funding level for the current and possibly future years. And it should detail, direct and indirect and other budget information as applicable, such as cost share, payment terms. It's going to set forth terms and conditions that relate to prior approval, that relate to programmatic changes, that relate to ownership of IP, of equipment, of the use of name, and a whole host of categories. If there's human subjects, there's going to be a lot of things about possibly HIPAA or human subject data. If there's export control considerations, there's going to be a lot of language related to that. It's going to provide contact information, typically both for the sponsor and for staff at UVA. And then oftentimes, the grantee accepts the terms and conditions upon signing. So a lot of awards will be bilateral, meaning both parties sign. In some cases, like NIH and NSF, it's when we draw down funds that we actually agree and accept the award. Okay, a couple more questions. So NSF salary for senior personnel is limited to ... It looks like everybody's on fire. The answer is 2. What is the name of NSF's Electronic Research Administration System? Everybody got it. And Jody just put a comment in there. I think Sarah Martin from C's PreAward took it recently and didn't recall page limit questions. So there you go. Yes. Yeah, thanks for sharing. So yeah, so Jingy shared some more information about the 2-month limit from the current NSF policies. Typically, it's limited to 2 months. We can budget additionally. If it's approved, we're good. But then an awardee can internally approve an increase or decrease in person months after an award is made. No prior approval is necessary as long as the change would not change the objectives or scope. So yeah, if we're going to, typically the rule is you're limited to budgeting 2 months. You can budget more. If it gets approved, you're good. During implementation, if something changes and we need to rebudget to more than 2 months, we could do that. But there just needs to be rationale for the rebudget and funding available to do it. But thanks for sharing, Jingy. That's great. Smiley face. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Okay. Part 2, uniform guidance, everybody's favorite topic. What is the uniform guidance? So it provides non-federal entities award requirements to manage federal awards. It lists out cost principles, provides guidance on determining allowable, allocable costs. There's special conditions to nonprofits relating to accounting practices. And then also subpart F governs audit, single audit. Irma will be here next week to talk about a lot of these things. So sort of an overview, OMB, guidance to manage grants and cooperative agreements is housed in the Code of Federal Regulations as Title II, Subtitle A, Chapter 2, Part 200, or 2 CFR 200. And it applies to federal agencies that make federal awards to non-federal entities. Governs grants and cooperative agreements. So we talked a little earlier about the fact that both grants, cooperative agreements, federal assistance fall under uniform guidance. So here are the 6 subparts of the UG. Subpart A is a bunch of acronyms and definitions. We're going to look at a few of those, but we'll sort of power through them. But the slides will all be here for you to reference back to. You can also access, if you Google 2 CFR 200, you can access the entire uniform guidance online. And uniform guidance, do I have a slide about this? No, okay. Uniform guidance essentially replaced a whole host of previous OMB circulars and regulations, such as A110, A122, A133, and consolidated the rules that governed nonprofits, state institutions, hospitals, Indian tribes, a whole host of groups from all these disparate but similar circulars into a singular, hence the name, uniform guidance, which makes life just much more easy and consistent, both for the federal agencies in terms of the terms that they're flowing down, also for recipients, because everything's here in one place. So here's the 6 subparts, so acronyms and definitions. Then there's general provisions, and then there's the pre-award requirements and contents of federal awards. So subpart C is typically, subpart C is specifically tailored to federal agencies. What do they need to include in their funding announcements? And what do they actually have to include in their federal awards? Subpart D is for recipients. So once we receive funding, what are we responsible for? So there's a whole host of things in here. Subrecipient monitoring, internal controls, financial management, property standards, procurement standards. The whole 300 series drives a lot of our university policies on a lot of different topics. Subpart E is the cost principles, what's allowable, what's not allowable. Subpart F, the audit requirements, the single audit. And so Irmela is going to talk a lot more next week about D, E, and F. I'm going to touch on a couple things in D and E as it relates to maybe budgeting or pre-award, but Irmela will be here to talk about the rest in the post-award session. There's also a number of appendices 1 through 12 as well. So acronyms and definitions, I'll let you read most of these things for yourselves. A lot of them are going to be familiar to you, such as F&A or the FAR, Federal Audit Clearinghouse, you know, IBS, Institutional Based Salary, MTDC, OMB, Payment Management System, that's where we draw down funds. It's the HHS website, PTEs, pass-through entity, SAM.gov. And then there's a whole host of definitions. So these are just sort of a highlight of a lot of them, such as cognizant agency for audit. Does anyone know who our cognizant agency is? Quiz, off the cuff. They also approve our F&A rate agreement. And I think it's also listed on the OSP Important Institutional Information page. DHSS, yes. Oh, good job, everybody. So contracts, so you remember back early on when we were talking about grants, cooperative agreements, and contracts, these things are actually defined in the uniform guidance. And so, as I said, in the federal sphere, we're talking about federal dollars. When we say grant or contract, those are not interchangeable terms. They have very different connotations. So a contract is a legal instrument by which a non-federal entity, so that would be, say, UVA, purchases property or services to carry out the project or program under a federal award. So that would be, we have an award, we have objectives, we're going to procure something to help us do what we said we were going to do. Cooperative agreement, so it's a legal instrument of financial assistance. So assistance, once again, is really a key delineator there between a federal awarding agency or pass-through entity and a non-federal entity. And so if you remember way back at the beginning, there was that flow chart sort of showing, you know, subaward, subaward, subaward. You know, if a pass-through entity was slowing down a cooperative agreement, that's what's covered here. Cost sharing or matching, sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. So that would be the portion of project costs not paid by federal funds. And if you go to 200.306, you can read about cost sharing or matching. I think Irmela will talk more about that in her post-award talk. Equipment. And so here's the official definition from the UG. So it's important to note, useful life, it's tangible personal property. So computers, machines, vehicles, useful life of more than 1 year, and a per unit acquisition cost essentially is greater than $5,000. So if we are budgeting for 3 computers, total cost of $7,500, that would not be equipment because the per unit price is not greater than $5,000. In a non-federal sense, if we're talking about foundations or other types of sponsors, they may have a different definition of equipment. So equipment's another one of those words that gets thrown around and could mean different things. So it's really important to know whether we're talking about federal regulations, whether we're talking about the uniform guidance, or if we're talking about some other sponsor's definition, and then making sure we read the solicitations and the terms and conditions. So expenditures, federal agency, federal share, so that's the portion of total project costs that are paid by federal funds, with cost share being the other part. The federal program, so that's all the awards which are assigned to a single number in the CFDA, the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. Everything gets rolled up together there. Federal financial assistance, so here's another one of those important definitions about assistance. So that means assistance that non-federal entities such as UVA receive or administer in the form of grants, cooperative agreements, non-cash contributions or donations of property, direct appropriations, food commodities, or other financial assistance. In my old life, I used to work for an NGO overseas running food programs, and we would literally receive from USDA millions of dollars of food commodities in the form of assistance as part of our cooperative agreement. So this is federal assistance. So it's an important thing, and you'll note grants and cooperative agreements once again called out predominantly here as federal assistance. Equipment, grant agreement, once again, just trying to drill home the difference between grants and contracts. It's a legal instrument of financial assistance between a federal awarding agency or a pass-through entity and a non-federal entity. Indirect costs or F&A costs. So here's another word that, depending on whether you're talking about federal funding or non-federal funding, say from the foundations or industry, F&A is a very specific kind of federal definition. If other sponsors are familiar with research funding, maybe they'll use that word, or maybe they'll use overhead or indirects or management fee or administration fee. There's a lot of different words that can kind of be used to mean the same thing. And typically that will be a percentage that we're allowed to apply on top of our total direct costs or modified total direct costs, which we'll look at that definition in a second, and take that percentage to cover sort of general costs that help us keep the lights on and have the resources that we need, but are not readily assignable to this specific cost objectives. So here's some more definitions. NTDC, if you look at UVA's F&A rate agreement, which is on the OSP site, it's also on the finance site under cost accounting. NTDC, modified total direct costs, means all direct salaries, wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, services, and travel, and up to the first 25K of every subaward. It excludes equipment, capital expenditures, patient care, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000. So in a federal sense, if UVA is getting an award, we would have our, we'd add up our whole budget, total direct costs, subtract out these categories of things, and that would be the NTDC modified total direct cost base on which we could apply our F&A. And I believe there'll be a session later in the CRA course about F&A specifically. Typically, someone from cost accounting comes. I think Andrew McGahee might come this year and walk through how that's, how do we come up with 61.5%? What's that based on? And go into a lot of detail about how it can be calculated. But this is where, it's literally called out in the UG, the definitions. So non-federal entity, OMB pass-through entity. So that's a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out part of a federal program. So way back at the beginning, that flow chart of federal funding, on going down the left-hand side, there's the federal government, goes to a grantee, and then it could go to a sub-grantee or a subrecipient. So that would be a subaward mechanism. All the terms and conditions of the federal award would flow down. The person in the middle would be called the pass-through entity. Participant support costs, so that's a big one for university research. Direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, and registration fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees, and that's a very important distinction, in connection with conferences or training projects. So typically, if you recall from the NTDC definition a second ago, this is something that has to be tracked separately to make sure F&A is not accrued on it. And so internally in UVA parlance, we would make a separate project for that. And yeah, so important definition to note. Period of performance might appear obvious, but this is the time in which we can incur charges and do work. If we incur a charge outside of the period of performance, there could be some agency-specific allowances, such as what we saw with NIH, where we can have 90 days pre-award spending. Anything beyond that may well require prior approval from the sponsor. So if we didn't have that approval in place and an auditor came, that cost could be disallowed, and the university would have to eat the funds, basically eat the cost, if there wasn't proper approval and documentation. Program income means gross income earned by the non-federal entity, so UVA. that is directly generated by a supporting activity or earned as a result of the federal award during the period of performance. So if in the course of our research we are doing something that is generating income, that constitutes program income. And typically there's 3 ways program income can be treated. I think Irma might talk about this next week, but it can either be added to the federal award. So say our award is $100,000, we earned $1,000 in program income. Now we have $101,000. That's called additive. It could be reduced from the federal award. So say our total award was $100,000, we earned $1,000. Well, the federal government's going to cut their share down to $99,000 now because we have this other $1,000. The total is still $100,000, but the federal share is being reduced by the amount of the program income. They're basically saying, hey, you're going to get the same total amount of money. You earn some money in the course of the research. So, we're going to reduce our share accordingly. That's called a reduction. And the last one would be cost share. If we had some sort of cost share commitment and we had program income, we could count that towards our cost share contribution. And typically the notice of award or if we are a subrecipient to somebody else, the FTP template that they're using should specify the method being used for program income. So here's some more about property, R&D, more definitions about, subaward. I think we've drilled some of these things home. Subrecipient, supplies. So this is an important one. And this is another thing that gets maybe misconstrued sometimes. So it's all tangible personal property other than those described in equipment. And so you'll notice in parentheses here, a computing device is a supply if the acquisition cost is less than basically $5,000, because that our equipment threshold is set at the same as the federal level, regardless of the length of its life. So important upfront in budgeting during proposals, knowing the per unit cost, whether something goes in supplies or whether something goes in equipment. It's important if we have subs on our proposal, we're reviewing their budgets, because if something's in supplies, we can charge F&A on it. If something's in equipment, we cannot. And also, there could be additional terms related to title or disposition of equipment as well that would maybe not be applicable to supplies. So it's really important to make sure we're budgeting those categories appropriately and know the ramifications of those things. Termination. So if a federal award gets terminated prior to the planned end of performance. Third-party in-kind contributions. So those are non-cash contributions provided by a third party. So say we had a sub to us, and that sub was donating some staff time or some hours or some supplies. That would be a third-party in-kind contribution that we would then want to track, and we would, as part of them invoicing us, want them to report and provide potentially corresponding backup documentation to support the valuation of those contributions. Unliquidated obligations. So there's sort of two definitions here depending on which accounting basis you're using. The cash basis, it would be obligations incurred by the non-federal entity that have not been paid or liquidated. And then on the accrual basis, these are obligations incurred by the non-federal entity for which an expenditure has not been recorded. And then the unobligated balance means the amount of funds under a federal award that the non-federal entity has not obligated. And this amount is calculated by subtracting the cumulative amount of the non-federal entity's unliquidated obligations and expenditure of funds from the cumulative amount of funds that the federal awarding agency has authorized us to obligate. So these are important definitions that come up a little bit more on the post-award side in terms of the actual expensing and reporting and invoicing of projects. And so I think Irma will probably talk more about some of those. They become really important in carry forward situations or at the end of awards as well. And you know, if there's sub grantees or if we're a sub to somebody else, there's just a few more things at play. Voluntary committed cost sharing. So that would be cost sharing specifically pledged on a voluntary basis, meaning it was not required by the solicitation, but we chose to include it in our proposal and quantify it. And so therefore it becomes a binding requirement of the federal award. This is something we try to avoid if we can, because it has some negative impacts, both on our F&A institutionally, and then also it's more administrative work because now we have to report on it and track it and have a cost share account and all these things. And Irma is going to talk more about cost share, I believe, next week as well. So a lot of definitions. So subpart B, these are the uniform administrative requirements that are going to be at play. Subpart C governs the use of grants, cooperative agreements, talks about public notice of federal programs, notice of funding opportunities, proposal review guidelines, awarding guidelines. So these are guidelines for the federal agency on the use of grant agreements, cooperative agreements. There's a type of grant mechanism that's called a what's it called? It's like a fixed award amount, a fixed amount award, sorry. And so it's basically, there could be deliverables tied to the payments, but it's still a grant, which is an interesting thing. And so there's some language around the applicability and conditions in which that can be used. So it's kind of like a event paid grant based on meeting specific deliverables. Yeah, so federal awarding agency is required to notify the public of federal assistance programs in the catalog of federal domestic assistance, which is maintained by the General Services Administration. And there's a whole host of requirements that they're required to list. And for competitive grants, cooperative agreements, they must announce specific funding opportunities with the following information. So, and it needs to be available at least 60 days. So they can't say, hey, next Friday there's a proposal that's due. There's certain conditions and information that they're required to provide. And proposal review guidelines, subpart C is telling the federal agencies certain criteria that they have to evaluate when they're looking at proposal review. And, you know, governs their merit review process. The federal agencies need to be cognizant of risk posed by the applicants. There's an OMB repository. Suspension and debarment requirements are called out. And the federal awarding agency or the pass-through may impose additional requirements when an applicant poses significant risk. So if you recall, you know, we talked about NIH, they have a lot of flexibilities built in of no cost extensions or pre-award spending. If they were awarding funds, part of their business review, say there was a new organization who never handled federal funds, they've never gone through a single audit, they might elect to add additional terms and conditions to that organization's award just because they don't have this performance track record. So that's some of the things that the federal agencies have to evaluate in complying with uniform guidance. And federal award conditions, cost reimbursable payments, they could require detailed invoicing or more frequent financial reports if needed. Yeah, and you know, unless there's some prohibition by federal statutes, the awarding agency or the pass-through entity could require the applicant to submit more frequent reps and certs. And this section also spells out the information that's required to be listed in the award. So the legal name, unique identifier, the federal award identification number, the FAIN, the award date, period of performance, the amount of funds obligated by this action, total funds obligated, approved budget. If there's cost sharing, it needs to be called out. And so there's a whole host of things that the uniform guidance is essentially telling the federal agencies, hey, you have to put all these things in your awards. So from our perspective, this is great because now there's at least some sort of standard, as standard as it gets with a bunch of disparate agencies that have their own templates and processes. But at least there's some commonalities around the information that's being provided. So here's just an example of an award information. You can see, you know, literally a lot of these fields that are required over here. You know, it specifies very clearly what instrument. It's a grant award, has the award number. It's new, has the DUNS number, has the proposal number, has our legal name. The title has the dollar amount, this action, and the total. If this was a modification, it might tell you that. And this is just a screen grab. Oh, it has a CFDA number. So this is just an example of, the types of information that's included on a notice of award. This one happens to be from O&R. And more requirements for the federal agencies. They have to disclose their spending on federal awards via FFATA, SAM.gov. They must also report the determination of non-qualification. So if they're telling someone they're not allowed to get funding, and they have to notify them, and if there's suspension or debarment, there's some of that process is spelled out as well. Essentially, if you're suspended or debarred, you're ineligible for participation in federal assistance programs or activities, which is why oftentimes we're asked if we're suspended or debarred. And also we ask that question to outgoing subs because it's part of the compliance that's required. Other relevant sections related to pre-awards from the UG, sub-award determinations, cost principles for budgeting at the proposal time. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the FDP research terms and conditions. So way back at the beginning, I mentioned, uniform guidance had something to say about the difference between subrecipients and contractors. So in 2 CFR 200.330, you will find the answer. So a pass-through entity. So let's take a scenario where NIH has given an award to UVA, and now we are going to issue some sort of sub-agreement to another party. The pass-through entity, which in this example would be UVA, must make case-by-case determinations whether each agreement it makes for the disbursement of federal program funds casts the party receiving the funds in the role of a subrecipient or a contractor. And here is a breakdown. Literally, it's spelled out in the UG. If you go to 2 CFR 200.330A, numbers 1 through 5, you'll find the left-hand column. If you go to B 1 through 5, you'll find the right-hand column. So a subrecipient relationship is someone who receives a subaward. The pass-through entity has to determine whether that entity is eligible to receive the assistance. So that goes back into a lot of the requirements about suspension and debarment, audits, et cetera, et cetera. The performance is measured in relation to the federal awards objectives. Number 3, I think, is really important. A subrecipient has responsibility for making programmatic decisions. So you think about a consortium arrangement where there's multiple PIs, PI at another institution, part of the research team, they're involved in the decision making. That looks like a sub-award relationship. Number 4 is also important. It adheres to the requirements, the federal requirements specified in the award. That means that these funds given to the subrecipient are still federal funds, and all the terms and conditions, the uniform guidance, cost principles, audits, all those things are applicable, and we need to flow those down if we're the pass-through entity to our sub. Or if we're the sub and say Virginia Tech or somebody is the pass-through entity, they're going to flow down all those terms to us. And once again, carries out a program for a public purpose as opposed to providing goods or services to the pass-through entity. So if you recall, once again, way at the very beginning, we talked about the differences between federal assistance, federal acquisition. One of the key delineators is the purpose. And so you see that literally called out here in the uniform guidance. Is this program for a public purpose as opposed to providing goods and services? So, we get a grant, we're procuring all types of supplies, right? We're buying masks, we're buying materials, we're buying pens, we're buying, other things that we need, computers. Those are things that would flow through UVA procurement. We're procuring things from vendors to provide for us to do our job. That's not a sub-award relationship. A sub-award is when, we're kind of taking part of our larger scope of work, and someone else is going to do part of it and be involved in the programmatic decisions, be involved in the research team. They're not providing goods or services. They're carrying out a program for a public purpose. Contrast that with the contractor. It's someone who receives procurement contracts to provide goods and services within normal business operations. They provide similar goods and services to many purchasers. They normally operate in a competitive environment. They provide ancillary goods or services to the federal program. And the last one is important. they're not subject to compliance requirements of the federal award. So if we have a contractor, we're buying pilot pens and they're supplying them to us, they receive money from us, from our grant. To them, we're not going to flow down our NIH R01 to some vendor who's selling us pilot pens. To them, those are not federal funds. They're not subject to the compliance requirements of the federal award. So that's a big distinction that's just important. It's literally spelled out in the uniform guidance. And one of the most important things, also stated verbatim, is the use of judgment in making determinations. The substance of the relationship is more important than the form of the agreement. So often, even from other research institutions, we'll get some sort of template that comes in and it's going to say contract on the top. But what's the substance of the relationship? It might actually be a, quote, subaward or subrecipient relationship and not a contractor. And so what ultimately takes the day is what is the nature of the relationship in relation to these requirements spelled out and these distinctions spelled out, more so than the name on the top of a template that somebody's using. So that's sort of an important requirement or important thing to understand. Just real quick, talking about research budgeting, sort of upfront on the proposal side. Here's just sort of a brief overlay of cost principles. Irmela is going to dive deep into this stuff next week, but they have to be reasonable. They have to be allocable to sponsor programs. They must be given consistent treatment. So that is, if UVA has a travel policy, or if UVA has a policy for students, or if UVA has a policy for equipment, whatever we're budgeting has to be consistent with how we treat those costs across the board. And they must conform to any limitations or exclusions. Some funding announcements might say, prior foreign travel is not allowed, or there could be some limitations. So it's important to pay attention to those specific exclusions that might be called out. And getting close to the end, FDP, Federal Demonstration Partnership. It's a cooperative initiative with 10 federal agencies and 154 institutional recipients of federal funds, including UVA. And the purpose is to reduce the administrative burden associated with research grants and contracts. There's a host of annual meetings and working groups. Here's a list of some of the 10 federal agencies. And very good news for us, a lot of the ones we work with the most, NIH, NSF, ONR, NASA, are members of the FDP. And one of the benefits of that is there is the FDP research terms and conditions, including the prior approval matrix. And let's see if is this going to open? Oh yeah, it did. Which, if you recall earlier, we were talking about, grants and cooperative agreements can be much more flexible. We talked about NIH specifically waiving the pre-award prior approval requirement. We talked about them waiving the 12-month, one-time no-cost extension requirement that the uniform guidance says they could impose and hold. And so this is a prior approval matrix for research terms and conditions that this group of agencies has said, and you can, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. You can go one by one and look through, here's the 90-day pre-award spending. You can see all the agencies have waived the prior approval requirement that they could have imposed on our agreement. And so the FDP research terms and conditions, these will usually be specified in our notice of award that these are applicable, and they're very awesome because it reduces the administrative burden and some of the post-award, to Jingy's point about rebudgeting authority. It opens the door for some additional flexibilities that these agencies in their role funding, assisting research for the public good, they know that things happen, they know that things change, and so they're building in some of these flexibilities to try to reduce administrative burden, both for the university, submitting all these prior approval requests, but also for them, because it's less things that they have to approve. And so, some of these expanded authorities, once again, we were talking earlier about, I think it's subpart C of uniform guidance, the risk review that the federal agencies have to conduct and pass-through entities have to conduct on their subs. If there was someone who was high risk or had not had experience with federal funding, the agency could choose to not grant some of these additional permissions, or a pass-through entity maybe is granted prior approval terms, the RTC from the prime, but they're working with a sub who's foreign or new, or there's something going on. They might impose more strict requirements. So this is something that's very great, but it's not an automatic, and there could be, things that happen that would preclude a group. What I'm trying to say is, just because it's NSF funding doesn't mean that NSF couldn't further restrict these, or that a pass-through entity couldn't require, this might say, hey, you can rebudget, up to a certain %, or you can do this thing. But the pass-through entity might say, no, actually, we're going to impose a stricter requirement on you. Jingy. So these are the only ones that are on the prior approval matrix, Jingy. ONR and EPA, they're members of FDP. They might have their own research terms and conditions that they house on their own website, but they're not on the prior approval matrix. So if they have any deviations from what's called out standardly in the uniform guidance, it might be on their own site. Like, I think ONR has their own, if I recall, grants guidelines, that would be the thing to consult. And like USDA, it's only the NIFA, I think, is that a department within USDA? I forget. It's either a funding mechanism or a department within USDA. It's not the whole USDA. So you have to make sure that you're talking about NIFA. So anyway, that is, I think, all we've got. Questions? Comments? And Jingy here, oops, sorry, I just sent that not to Jingy. Jingy, I think this is the, here's the terms and conditions. Like for ONR, for example, they have some R&D terms and conditions, which is sort of their equivalent of the research terms and conditions. And how basically uniform guidance says all these things, here's how we're deviating from that as an agency. And yes, I think Rita and Julia have both PowerPoint decks, and we'll distribute those potentially along with the recording. Rita, I'll let you chime in on how and when that'll go out.
Yes, I will follow up tomorrow with an email, and I will send, if I can send a link to this for the live, that would be great. I think that's what I can do. And then I'll definitely attach the PowerPoint presentation. So well done, Stephen. Thank you so much for all that. Does anyone else have any questions?
And if you think of something, whenever in the next course of days, feel free to email me, email Rita. We'll get you an answer.
Awesome. All right. Well, we got an extra almost 18 minutes or so to lunch, so take it. Stephen, I appreciate it. Everyone, we will see you next week. If you can't make it, just let us know, and I'll definitely get the information out to you for the following week after. And we'll keep progressing as the weeks move on. So have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.